Goodfellas ends on one final image. Henry Hill, in a bathrobe, shuffling out for the morning paper, grumbling that he now has to live like a regular nobody. The film tells you he went quiet, stayed clean, and faded away. Almost none of that was true. The real Henry Hill spent another 30 years out in the open, getting into trouble, going on television, writing books, and somehow no one ever came for him. And he was not the first to break the code, not the lowest, not the strangest. The truth about what informing actually was is the part the film refuses to show you. The code Goodfellas treats as sacred was already rotting from the top down. Flipping reached all the way to sitting bosses. It cost some men their own children, and it was never the quiet little ending the movie sells. 10 real cases, spanning decades and 2 countries, and one choice the camera always looks away from. Section 1. The ending. Goodfellas couldn't show you. Goodfellas leaves you with Henry Hill in a bathrobe, shuffling out to grab the morning paper from the front step of a plain suburban house. He complains that he now has to live out his days as a regular nobody. The screen tells you he went into hiding, stayed safe, and cleaned himself up. Then the credits roll, and for most people, that is the last they ever think about him. What the film never shows is that the real Henry Hill had another 32 years ahead of him, and almost none of those years looked anything like the neat goodbye the movie hands you. Begin with who he really was. Hill was born in Brooklyn in 1943. His father was Irish and worked as an electrician, and his mother was Sicilian. That mixed background mattered far more than the film admits, because it meant Hill could never become a full member of the people he spent his life around. He was always an outsider, standing close to the heat. As a young man, he latched onto a local boss named Paul Vario, the figure the film renames Paulie. And for years, he earned alongside the Lucchese family without ever truly belonging to it. By 1980, the law had finally boxed him in. Hill was picked up on charges tied to moving large amounts of product, and he was staring at a long stretch behind bars. He had also become convinced that his own friends were getting ready to have him taken out. So he made the choice the movie does put on screen. He sat down with federal agents and told them everything he knew. His information helped lock away dozens of people, including Vario and the man the film calls Jimmy Conway, whose real name was Jimmy Burke. Hill and his wife Karen were handed new names and moved into the Witness Protection Program. Here is where the movie stops and the real story keeps going. On paper, the film wants you to believe Hill settled down and stayed straight. He did neither. The truth is that he could not stop being Henry Hill. He kept slipping back into old habits, and worse, he kept telling people exactly who he was. In 1987, he was picked up in Seattle on charges connected to moving the powder, and after a string of similar slip-ups, the program finally ran out of patience. In the early 1990s, he and his family were tossed out of the very thing meant to keep them alive. The steady marriage the movie shows you fell apart too. He and Karen separated in 1989, and the divorce was not finalized until 2002. Free of the program, Hill did the exact opposite of disappearing. The film had turned him into a household name, and he chased that fame with both hands. He sat for interviews, he went on the radio, he put his face in front of the public over and over. The same face plenty of serious people had good reason to remember. He even wrote books about his old life, including a cookbook stuffed with the Italian recipes he describes so lovingly in the film. His slip-ups, though, never really ended. All through the 2000s, he kept landing back in front of a judge. He was picked up in Seattle again. In 2004, police stopped him at a small airport in Nebraska and charged him over a controlled substance. And the next year, he was given a short stretch behind bars for it. In 2009, he was placed on probation after being found heavily under the influence in public, And later that same year, he was back in custody for causing a scene and giving officers a hard time. One time in Nebraska, he showed up to meet a probation officer with a reading more than 4 times the legal limit to get behind the wheel. Through all of it, he was living a quiet small-town life, working as a cook and helping run an Italian restaurant, while remaining one of the most recognizable former insiders in the entire country. Now, here is the part that makes the whole thing genuinely strange. By every rule the film teaches you, Henry Hill should not have lasted a year. He turned on his own people. He got himself thrown out of the only shield the government gave him. Then he spent the rest of his life broadcasting his name on television and in print. The people he had informed on had every reason in the world to come looking, and not one of them ever did. What finally caught up with Henry Hill was not an old enemy. It was his own body. Decades of hard living wore him down, and on June 12, 2012, he passed away in a Los Angeles hospital from heart problems. He was 69. He went peacefully, in a bed, with a partner beside him, which is just about the last way anyone expected him to go. For a man who had spent years sure that the end would come at someone else's hands, it was a remarkably ordinary finish. That gap is the entire point. The film treats informing as a kind of slow vanishing, the moment a huge life shrinks down into a sad little box. The real story is messier and far less comforting. Flipping did not erase Henry Hill. It simply turned him into a different kind of public figure, one who kept stumbling and somehow kept walking away. But Hill was never the first person to break the code, and he was nowhere close to the most important. To understand why this world treats informing as the lowest thing a person can do, you have to go back nearly 20 years before he was ever picked up. You have to go to a man who sat in front of the entire country on live television and said out loud for the very first time what these families truly were. Section 2. The Man Who Said It Out Loud. Henry Hill broke a promise. Joseph Valachi broke the silence itself, and he did it almost 20 years earlier in front of the largest audience anyone in his world had ever faced. Valachi was not a boss. He was a soldier in the Genovese family, one of the lowest ranks a made man can hold. For more than 30 years, he had been a small piece of a very large machine, running errands, earning, and keeping his mouth shut like everyone else. Nobody outside the organization had ever heard his name. That was the whole idea. Men like Valachi were meant to live and fade away without the public ever knowing they existed. By the early 1960s, he was behind bars, serving a long sentence tied to moving product. And here's the strange twist that set everything in motion. The federal prison held not only Valachi, but also Vito Genovese, the powerful boss of the very family Valachi belonged to. The two men were locked up in the same place at the same time. Genovese became convinced that Valachi had been talking to the authorities. By Valachi's own telling, Genovese pulled him close in the prison yard and gave him a kiss on the cheek. In their world, that small gesture was not affection. It was a signal that a man had been marked, that his own people had decided he could not be trusted, and his time was running short. Valachi understood exactly what it meant, and from that moment, he was certain his boss wanted him gone. Living in fear inside those walls, Valachi made a terrible mistake. He spotted another inmate and became convinced this was the man sent to finish him. He grabbed a length of pipe and went after him. The inmate did not survive. The problem was that Valachi had the wrong man. The person he attacked had nothing to do with any plan against him. For that, Valachi was handed a life sentence on top of the time he was already serving. Now, he was truly trapped. He was facing the rest of his life inside. He was sure his own family wanted him taken out,
and he had no way to protect himself. So he made the choice almost no one in his position had ever made. He decided to tell the government everything.
What happened next changed the fight against organized crime forever. In the autumn of 1963, Valachi sat down before a committee of United States senators led by John McClellan. The hearings were carried on television and watched by millions of ordinary Americans. Behind him stood large charts covered with names and photographs, laying out the families like a company flowchart. And then, a made man did something no made man had ever done in public. He admitted, plainly and on the record, that this secret society was real. Up to that point, the government could not even get insiders to agree the thing existed. Bosses denied it, soldiers denied it. The official line was that there was no such organization at all. Valachi blew that apart. He described how the families were built, how new members were brought in through a sworn ritual, how orders flowed from the top down, and how the rules of silence held everyone in place. He also handed the public a phrase that has stuck ever since. He explained that insiders did not call themselves the Mafia. Among themselves, he said, they used the words Cosa Nostra, which means our thing. The reaction was enormous. The Attorney General at the time, Robert Kennedy, called Valachi's information the single biggest breakthrough the country had ever had against organized crime. For the first time, investigators had a map drawn by someone who had lived on the inside. New units were formed. More lawyers were put to work chasing these groups. A wall of secrecy that had shielded the families for generations now had a permanent crack running through it, and everyone could see it. But here is the part that matters most for our story. Valachi broke the code, and it bought him nothing close to freedom. There was no witness protection program waiting to hand him a new name and a quiet new town. That system did not even exist yet. After he finished talking, Valachi went right back to prison, where he stayed. He spent the rest of his days locked away, watched and alone. And he passed away there in 1971, still serving his sentence. Think about what that means next to the ending Goodfellas gives Henry Hill. The movie suggests that flipping is a quiet kind of vanishing, a man trading the high life for a dull but safe one. Valachi shows you the older, harder truth. The very first man to truly break the silence did not get a cookbook deal or a house in the suburbs. He got a microphone for a few weeks and a cell for the rest of his life. He talked, the whole country listened, and then he simply went back inside and stayed until the end. And the bosses he embarrassed told themselves a comforting story about it. Valachi, they said, was just one broken-down soldier, a low-level nobody who cracked under pressure. The men at the top of the families were untouchable, loyal to the bone, and would never break. They held on to that belief for decades. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. They were wrong. Years later, one of the most feared bosses in America would be brought down, not by some forgotten soldier, but by the man standing closest to his throne. His own right hand would walk into a courtroom and take him apart, piece by piece. Section 3. The bargain nobody talks about. The man standing closest to the throne was named Salvatore Gravano, though almost everyone knew him as Sammy the Bull. He was a former boxer from Brooklyn who had clawed his way up to underboss of the Gambino family, the number 2 spot in what was then the most famous mafia family in America. The boss above him was John Gotti, a loud, flashy figure the newspapers loved and the public could not stop watching. Gravano and Gotti rose together, and they rose by shoving aside the man at the top. In 1985, the sitting head of the Gambino family, Paul Castellano, was taken out in the street outside a New York steakhouse. That single move cleared the way for Gotti to step into the top job, with Gravano right beside him. For the next several years, the two were partners at the very peak of the underworld. Then it fell apart, and it fell apart because of Gotti's own mouth. Federal agents had secretly recorded Gotti talking inside a Manhattan hangout. When Gravano later heard what was on those recordings, he realized his boss had been running him down behind his back and quietly setting him up to take the blame for things they had both done. Gravano decided he was not going to be the fall guy. In 1991, he did the unthinkable for a man of his rank. He went to the government and offered to testify against the boss he had served. This is the moment the whole machine turns, and it is the moment movies like Goodfellas never sit you down and explain. Gravano was not a small-time errand boy. By his own admission, he had taken part in 19 hits over the course of his life. He had personally carried out only one of them. In the rest, he helped plan them, gave orders, or was part of the group behind them. 19 lives. That is the record the man brought to the table. And here is what the government gave him in return. Under his deal, he could have faced up to 20 years. Instead, he was sentenced to 5. He had already spent close to 4 years locked up while cooperating, which meant he was looking at only a handful of months left to serve. Think about that math for a moment. One of the most important members of an American mafia family answered for 19 lives, with roughly half a year of jail time still ahead of him. The judge who handed down that sentence even said in open court that Gravano's choice to cooperate was the bravest thing he had ever seen in a courtroom. Their reasoning was cold and simple. The government was not interested in Gravano for his own sake. It wanted the man above him. Gravano walked into court and calmly took John Gotti apart, explaining how the family worked, who gave which orders, and how the whole thing ran. In 1992, partly because of that testimony, Gotti was found guilty and sent away for the rest of his life with no chance of release. Prosecutors said Gravano's help led to more than 30 other mob figures being convicted or pleading guilty as well. It is a hard truth, but the bigger the name you can deliver, the more the system will look past what you have done yourself. Stop and compare that to the men we have already met. Henry Hill was a low-level associate who flipped to save himself from a long sentence. Joseph Valachi was a soldier who talked and then sat in a cell until the end. Gravano was the number 2 man of a major family, carrying a far heavier record than either of them, and he received the lightest deal of all. The closer you stand to the top, it turns out, the more your testimony is worth, and the more the system is willing to forgive to get it. That is not how the movies frame informing. They treat it as the act of a weak, cornered nobody. The real bargain often rewards the powerful most of all. There is one more piece that destroys any idea of a clean, happy ending. After his short sentence, Gravano was released and moved to Arizona under a new identity. He did not stay quiet, and he did not stay straight. He soon left the protection program, started giving interviews, and even put out a book about his life. Then he went back to his old ways in a big way. By the year 2000, he was running a large operation moving a party pill called ecstasy, an enterprise authorities said was pulling in around $500,000 a week. His own wife and grown children were pulled into the case alongside him. He was picked up again, and this time, there was no sweet deal. He was sent away for close to 2 decades and was not released until 2017. So the story the government tells, and the story Goodfellas hints at, is that flipping turns a gangster into a witness, and a witness into a reformed man living quietly somewhere far away. Gravano blows a hole in that idea. He gave the government its biggest target, took the reward, and then went right back to building a brand new empire of his own in the underworld. The man did not change. He simply traded one role for another whenever it suited him. And Gravano was not alone in proving that the famous code of loyalty was already rotting from the inside. Around the very same time he flipped, an even higher-ranking figure made the same choice in another of New York's great families. He was not an underboss. He was running an entire family as its acting boss. And what finally pushed him to talk was the discovery that his own leaders had quietly ordered his end. Section 4. When the bosses turned on their own. Here is a name that should sound familiar by now. Before Alphonse Darco was anybody, he came up in the same Brooklyn crew that produced Henry Hill, working under the very same local boss, Paul Vario. Two men, the same starting point. One stayed a low-level associate his whole life. The other climbed all the way to the top of a major New York family. And in the end, both of them did the exact same thing. Darco, known on the street as Little Al, became a made member of the Lucchese family in 1982. Over the next decade, he kept rising from soldier to captain until he reached a level Henry Hill could only have dreamed about. In early 1991, the family's top two leaders, boss Vic Amuzzo and his number two, Anthony Casso, got wind that the government was closing in on them. They went on the run and left Darco in charge as acting boss. For a short while, Little Al was effectively running one of the most powerful families in the country. The trouble was that the men he answered to had become something close to monsters. Amuzzo and Casso were jumpy, greedy, and quick to turn on anyone they suspected. They did not just go after enemies, they went after their own people, again and again, on the thinnest of suspicions. One Lucchese member named Bruno Facciola was suspected of talking to the law, so the order came down to do away with him. After it was done, they left a canary tucked in his mouth, the old underworld sign for a man who had broken the code. It was meant as a warning to everyone else. It got worse from there. The bosses became convinced, wrongly, that one of their own captains, Peter Chiodo, had turned. They sent men after him. Chiodo was struck a dozen times in an attempt on his life, and by sheer luck he lived. His heavy build kept the wounds from finishing the job. The irony is brutal. He was not an informant when they came for him, but after his own family tried to end him over a false suspicion, he became one for real. Around the same time, Amuzzo even ordered an entire branch of the family in New Jersey taken out, simply because they refused to hand over a bigger cut of their money. This was the world Darco was now standing in the middle of. He was the acting boss, but he could see the pattern plainly. He had helped carry out the family's orders for years. Now those same orders were starting to point at him. The leaders he served were removing loyal men on guesswork and fear, and there was no way to prove your innocence once the suspicion landed. In September 1991, Darco went to a meeting of Lucchese leaders at a Manhattan hotel. As the meeting dragged on, he noticed something that made his stomach drop. One of the soldiers in the room had a weapon tucked into his waistband. Darco became certain, right there, that he had been called to that room so they could do away with him next. He made an excuse and got out of the building as fast as he could. For a man at the top of his world, walking out of that hotel and not back in was the beginning of the end of everything he knew. He did not go home and wait to find out if he was right. 3 days later, on September 21st, 1991, Alphonse Darco sat down with FBI agents and agreed to cooperate. With that single decision, he became the first acting boss of a New York family ever to flip and work with the government. No one at his level had done it before, and his timing changed everything, because this came just weeks before Sammy Gravano made his own move in the Gambino family. Darco going first helped crack the whole thing open, and a flood of others soon followed. What he gave the government was staggering. Darco knew the inner workings of not just his own family, but the others too, because the bosses of New York met and did business together. His testimony helped convict more than 50 members of the underworld over the years. Among them were Vicamuso, the boss who had wanted him gone, along with leaders of the Colombo, Bonanno, and Genovese families, including the famously slippery Vincent Gigante. Darko himself had a hand in at least 8 hits during his life, yet he became one of the most valuable witnesses the government had ever turned. He spent more than 10 years testifying, then lived quietly in protection until he passed away in 2019, an old man far from the streets he came from. Now think about what his story really tells you. Goodfellas and movies like it lean hard on the idea of the code, the sacred loyalty that supposedly held these families together. The film treats informing as the one unforgivable sin, the betrayal of a brotherhood. But Darko shows you that by the early 1990s, the brotherhood was already eating itself. The code did not get broken from the bottom by weak men looking for an easy way out. It got broken from the top because the bosses themselves had made staying loyal a fast way to end up tucked in a trunk. The honor the movies love to romanticize had quietly curdled into something none of these men could trust. When your own leaders will take you out on a hunch, loyalty stops being honor and starts being a quick way to get yourself finished. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Darko was the highest-ranking member ever to flip at that point. The bosses surely told themselves it could never go any higher, that no true, fully seated boss would ever stoop to it. But the ladder had one more rung. A man who held the very top job in a New York family outright, not as a fill-in, but as the real, crowned boss, was about to do something even Darko had not. He would not only turn on his own family, he would put on a hidden recorder and trap the man he had handed his throne to.
Section 5. The Boss Who Wore the Wire.
By the start of the 2000s, Joseph Massino had earned a nickname that said everything about where he stood. People called him the Last Don. He had a simple claim to the title. He was the only boss of New York's 5 great families who was not sitting in a prison cell. Everyone else at his level had been locked away. Big Joey, as they knew him, was still standing. He had not gotten there by being soft. Massino started out hijacking trucks and worked his way up in the Bonanno family. In 1981, to lock down his own power, he arranged to have 3 rebel captains taken out in a single night, then did away with a rival named Sonny Black soon after. A few years later, while he was behind bars on a separate case, the old boss passed, and Massino stepped into the top job. When he got out in 1992, he rebuilt a family that had nearly fallen apart, and he ran it with a level of caution no one had seen before. He was so worried about hidden recorders that he told his men to stop saying his name out loud. Instead, when they wanted to refer to him, they would tug on their earlobe. That is how careful the man was. And that detail matters because of what he did later. In July 2004, the careful boss finally lost. A jury found Massino guilty on every count against him, including a string of hits stretching back decades. He was looking at the rest of his life behind bars. And then the government showed him something that changed his entire approach. A fresh case was coming, one that could have brought down the most severe punishment the federal system is allowed to hand out. Suddenly, the man who had spent his life dodging hidden recorders was staring at the very end of the road. So Big Joey did the one thing no man in his position had ever done. The crowned, fully seated boss of a New York family walked over to the government's side.
He became the first official boss of one of the 5 families ever to cooperate.
Remember, this was the most security-obsessed leader of his generation, the one who would not even let people speak his name. Now, he was naming everyone. He pointed investigators to a quiet, empty lot where 2 men taken out back in 1981 had been buried, and agents dug them up. As part of the deal, he handed over $12 million of his own money. The Last Don was now a witness.
But Massino did not stop at talking. He went a step further, into territory that would have been unthinkable to him a year earlier. While he was being held, he agreed to wear a hidden recorder and sit down with the man he had personally left in charge of the family, an acting boss named Vincent Basciano, known on the street as Vinnie Gorgeous. In those recorded talks, Basciano admitted to ordering a man taken out, and reportedly even floated a plan to go after a federal prosecutor. The boss who had once banned his own crew from saying his name was now the one carrying the bug. He used everything he knew about how these men talked, and he turned it against his own chosen successor. The reward for all of this was exactly the kind of trade we have already seen, only now at the very top of the ladder. Massino testified, and his cooperation was treated as enormously valuable. In 2013, the life sentence he had been handed was cut down to the time he had already served, a little more than 10 years. He was released to live under government supervision for the rest of his days. In court, he offered a quiet apology, saying he thought about the people he had harmed and the families of those who did not survive his years in power. The judge made it clear the court had no illusions about why a man like Massino had decided to help. Everyone in the room understood the truth. He talked to save himself, and it worked. This is the ceiling.
Stop and take in how far we have climbed across these stories. A street-level associate flipped, a foot soldier flipped, an underboss flipped, an acting boss flipped. And now, the real crowned boss of a New York family had not only flipped, but had strapped on a recorder to bring down his own heir. Each step up, the families told themselves the next man would surely never break. Each time, they were wrong. There is no higher rank left to reach, and the man at the very top failed the famous test the moment his own neck was on the line. That is what makes Massino so damaging to the story Goodfellas tells. The film treats the code of silence as something sacred, a brotherhood so strong that breaking it is the ultimate sin. Massino proved the code was mostly a tool, a rule the bosses used to keep their soldiers loyal while quietly reserving the right to break it themselves when survival demanded it.
If the boss himself would not go down for the code, no one beneath him had any real reason to either. Even Massino's own lawyers stood up in court and said it plainly, that the code of silence was finished, and that this whole world was now on the run. And here is where the story has to grow bigger than New York. So far, every man we have met operated inside America, inside a system with new identities and protected towns waiting at the end. But the most painful informant story of all did not happen here. It happened across the ocean, in a place where breaking the code did not cost a man his comfort or his freedom. It cost him his children. Section 6. The Man Who Paid with His Family. Tommaso Buscetta was not a small-timer scraping by on the edges. They called him the boss of the two worlds, and he earned the name. He ran smuggling operations that stretched from the old country across the ocean to South America, first moving cigarettes and later far more dangerous product.
He was Sicilian, raised inside the original Mafia, and for most of his life he believed in it the way other men believe in a religion. To him, there were rules. There was a code that meant something. And then he watched that whole idea get torn to pieces. In the early 1980s, a new and far more savage group seized control of the Sicilian Mafia. Led by a man named Salvatore Riina, they did not bother with the old understandings. They launched a sweeping purge, hunting down rivals across the island and removing anyone who stood in their way or might one day get in it. The Mafia Buscetta thought he belonged to, with its supposed honor and its limits, simply stopped existing. In its place was a machine that fed on its own people. What happened to Buscetta's family is the part that should stay with you.
As the new bosses tightened their grip, they came for the people closest to him. Over a short and terrible stretch, many of his relatives were taken from him.
The hardest blow of all was the loss of 2 of his own sons, who simply vanished and were never found. Sit with that for a second. This is what breaking from this world can actually cost, and it is the exact thing Goodfellas never lets you see. The film leaves Henry Hill bored in a quiet house. The real price for a man like Buscetta was burying the hope that he would ever see his children again. He was living in Brazil when police there picked him up and sent him back to Italy in the mid-1980s. Waiting for him was a determined magistrate named Giovanni Falcone, a man who had spent years trying to crack the mafia open and could never get an insider to talk. Buscetta talked. He did not do it to dodge a sentence the way the American informants had. He did it because the organization he had given his life to had already taken everything from him, and because he no longer recognized what it had become. What he handed Falcone was the key to the entire structure.
Over roughly 45 days of careful questioning, Buscetta laid out exactly how the Sicilian mafia was built. His most important revelation was the existence of a ruling body at the top, a kind of board of directors that signed off on the major decisions. That single piece of information changed everything, because it meant the mafia could be treated as one single organization, and its leaders could be held responsible for the crimes carried out under their orders. For the first time, prosecutors were not chasing shadows. They had a map of the whole thing, drawn by a man who had sat near its center. That map became the Maxi trial, held in Palermo in the mid-1980s. The authorities built a special fortified courtroom just to contain it, because hundreds of defendants were on trial at once. In the end, around 475 members of the mafia were charged, and more than 300 of them were convicted. The most powerful bosses received life sentences.
Nothing on that scale had ever been done to the organization before, and it happened because one man who had lost everything decided to speak. The people who made it possible paid dearly. The 2 brave magistrates who led the fight, Giovanni Falcone and Paolo Borsellino, were both targeted and taken out in 1992 in huge, carefully planned attacks that shook the entire country. Most men would have gone quiet after that, frightened into keeping their heads down. Buscetta did the opposite. After the magistrates were gone, he opened up even further and began describing the links between the mafia and powerful figures in Italian politics, the connections he had been too careful to touch before. For his own protection, Buscetta was eventually brought to the United States and placed in the Witness Protection Program. He became an American citizen. He passed away from illness in the year 2000, an old man living under a name that was not his own. He had helped bring down an empire, but he never got back the family that empire took from him. This is why Buscetta matters so much to our story. Goodfellas, and most movies about this life, frame informing as a small and selfish act, the move of a coward looking for a soft place to land. Buscetta turns that idea upside down. His decision to talk was not an escape. It was a direct strike against the thing that had destroyed his family, and it brought results no investigator had ever come close to. The film wants you to believe the worst part of flipping is the boredom that follows. The truth is that the boredom is the lucky version. The real cost, the one the camera never shows, can be every single person you love. He gave more than any informant before him, and he lost more than any of them too. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously.
And there is one more kind of informant we have not looked at yet. One who breaks the simple picture entirely. Up to now, every man in this story talked to survive, to get even, or because grief had left him nothing else to hold on to. But there was another type. There was a man who fed secrets to the government for decades,
while never once stopping his own brutal work, protected the whole time by the very people who were supposed to be hunting men like him. Section 7. The Reaper on the Payroll. Every man we have met so far fits a shape you can understand. They turned because they were cornered, or out for revenge, or because grief had hollowed them out. Gregory Scarpa fits none of those shapes, and that is exactly why his story matters. He breaks the comfortable picture of what an informant even is. Scarpa was a captain in the Colombo family, and by every account he was one of the most feared men in the entire New York underworld.
His reputation for brutality was so well known that he was thought to have taken out more people than just about anyone of his generation. He even carried a street name so dark that it told you, all on its own, exactly what kind of man he was. People were genuinely afraid of him, and they had every reason to be. Here is the secret almost no one knew. For most of his adult life, this terrifying captain was also quietly working for the FBI. He had started feeding the Bureau information about his fellow mobsters back in the 1960s, drifted away from them for a while, and then, in 1980, a determined agent named Lindley DeVecchio brought him back into the fold. From that point on, Scarpa lived a double life that ran for years. To the underworld, he was a loyal, dangerous Colombo captain. To the government, he was a secret source, handing over details on the very people he stood beside. And this is the part that should stop you cold. Being an informant did not slow Scarpa down even a little. The entire time he was meeting with his FBI handler, he kept doing his own brutal work out on the street. During a long and vicious power struggle inside the Colombo family, when men were being taken out left and right, Scarpa was right in the middle of it. Think about what that means in plain terms. A man who was supposed to be helping the law bring down dangerous people was, at the very same moment, one of the most dangerous people out there. The government was not using a small fish to land a bigger one. It had a truly frightening man on its books, and it kept him there for years while he carried on exactly as before. It gets worse, and here I have to be careful and precise, because this is where fact and accusation sit very close together. Prosecutors later came to believe the relationship between Scarpa and his handler had crossed a terrible line. They accused DeVecchio of secretly feeding Scarpa confidential information from inside the FBI, including the names of people suspected of being informants or rivals, which Scarpa then allegedly used to hunt those people down. In 2007, DeVecchio was charged with 4 serious counts, each tied to a person who had been taken out. The case was described at the time as one of the worst examples of law enforcement corruption the country had ever seen. Now here is the crucial part that a lot of dramatic retellings leave out. That case against DeVecchio fell apart. In the middle of the trial, the testimony of the main witness, a woman who had been close to Scarpa for years, was badly damaged when an old recorded interview surfaced that contradicted what she was now saying on the stand. The charges were dropped. DeVecchio was never found guilty of anything. He has always denied any wrongdoing, and a large number of former agents stood firmly behind him.
Years later, a judge did say in court that, in his personal opinion, DeVecchio had passed along information that ended up getting people taken out. But an opinion from the bench is not a verdict, and it is important to say plainly that the accusations against him were never proven in a court of law. As for Scarpa himself, the double life finally ended. In 1993, he admitted to racketeering charges, and he passed away behind bars in 1994. There would be no plea deal turning him into a star witness in open court the way it had gone for others. The man who had spent decades playing both sides at once simply died as a prisoner. So why does a case this messy belong in this story? because it shatters the clean idea of informing that movies like Goodfellas quietly sell you. In the film, and in most mob tales, informing is presented as a simple moral trade. The government takes a flawed man and uses him to bring down worse men, and justice comes out the other end. Scarpa shows you the dark version of that trade. The system can keep a truly dangerous man on its payroll for decades, can grow so close to him that the line between the hunter and the hunted starts to blur, and can end up in a place where serious people genuinely argue about who was really using whom. It raises a question the movie never wants you to ask. If the government can protect a man like Scarpa for that long, where is the line between catching the dangerous ones and quietly keeping one of your own? That is a picture Goodfellas would never put on screen, because it complicates the simple story far too much. The film needs informing to feel like a fall from grace. Scarpa proves it can just as easily be a shield handed to someone who never planned to change at all. And yet, for all the men in this story who started inside that world and then turned against it, there is one figure who flips the whole idea on its head. He was never a gangster at all. He walked into the underworld from the outside, built a completely false life inside one of New York's most dangerous families, earned their trust for years, and came within a hair of being formally welcomed in as one of their own, all while carrying a badge the entire time. Section 8. The Cop Who Became One of Them. Stop and notice how different this next man is from everyone else in this story. Every figure we have looked at so far was born into that world, or chose it, and then turned against it. Joseph Pistone never belonged to it at all. He was an FBI agent, and he walked straight into the heart of the Mafia on purpose, pretending to be something he was not, for years. In 1976, the Bureau sent Pistone undercover with a brand new identity. On the street, he was Donnie Brasco, a smooth, low-key jewel thief looking to make the right connections. The assignment was only supposed to last about 6 months. Instead, it stretched on for roughly 5 years.
He learned the trade, the slang, and the way these men carried themselves, until he could move among them without raising a single eyebrow. No FBI agent had ever managed to plant himself inside one of New York's famous 5 families before. Pistone did exactly that, slipping into the Bonanno family and earning the trust of men who would have done away with him in a heartbeat had they known the truth. What makes the story almost unbelievable is how far inside he got. Pistone was taken under the wing of a longtime soldier named Lefty Ruggiero, who treated him like a protege and vouched for him. Later, he operated under a powerful captain known as Sonny Black. These were not men who trusted easily. They lived in a world where a single mistake could end you. And yet they brought Donnie Brasco closer and closer, until he was standing right on the edge of becoming a full, formal member of the family. He was only months away from being made.
That last step is what brought the whole thing to a close. To be fully accepted, Brasco would have to prove himself by carrying out a hit. The order eventually came, with a specific target attached. This was the line the Bureau would not let its agent cross. It was the one thing the badge could never allow. Rather than let Pistone go any further, the FBI pulled him out in the summer of 1981 and ended the operation. Earlier in the job, when he had been pushed towards similar tasks, the Bureau had quietly stepped in, taking the intended targets into protective custody and making it look as though the work had been done. But becoming a made man was a step too far and too dangerous, so they brought him home. The damage Pistone had done from the inside was enormous. The evidence he gathered led to more than 200 people being charged and over 100 convicted. No bug, no wiretap, no flipped witness had ever delivered a blow quite like it, because the information came straight from a man they had welcomed in themselves. The Bonanno family was left in ruins, so badly embarrassed that the other bosses kicked it off the commission, the ruling board that sat at the very top of the New York underworld. This is the same wreckage that, years later, Joseph Massino would spend so much effort trying to rebuild. One outsider with a fake name had nearly brought an entire family to its knees. But the people who paid the steepest price were not the ones who got arrested. They were the men who had vouched for Donnie Brasco. In that world, letting an enemy walk in among you is an unforgivable failure, and someone always answers for it. Sonny Black, the captain who had brought Brasco up and spoken for him, was taken out by his own people in 1982 as punishment for the disaster. Think about how strange that is. Pistone never turned on anyone because he was never truly one of them. Yet his success still ended with insiders losing their lives simply for having believed his act. For Pistone himself, the cost was a life permanently changed. Once the Mafia understood that a federal agent had been living among them, they put a price on his head, $500,000 to anyone who could find him. He has spent the years since living carefully, watching his back, his real life folded away for safety. Even now, decades later, he cannot simply walk around as Joe Pistone in the open the way the rest of us can. He later wrote a book about the whole experience, which became a well-known movie, with Johnny Depp playing the agent and Al Pacino playing the aging soldier who never knew his friend was a fake. Here is why Pistone matters so much to the bigger picture. The word informant gets thrown around as if it means one single thing, but it really hides two very different people.
One is the member who turns, the man who took the oath and then broke it, like almost everyone else in this story. The other is the infiltrator, the outsider who was never part of that world at all and walked in wearing a mask. Goodfellas only ever flirts with the first kind, and it never shows the second. That second kind may be the most frightening idea of all to these families, because it means the threat is not always a traitor sitting at your own table. Sometimes it is a complete stranger who was never one of you to begin with. The famous Code of Silence is built to punish members who talk. It is completely useless against a man who never swore the oath in the first place. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. So far, this whole story has lived in the courtroom and on the street, in testimony and betrayal and survival. But there is one informant whose story took an almost unreal turn, one that connects this entire dark world directly to the movie screen. He did not just help bring down his own crew. He went on to help one of the most famous directors alive recreate that life for a camera. And in one strange moment, he stood in front of that camera and played a version of himself. Section 9. The Informant Who Played Himself. Frank Collada grew up on the streets of Chicago, where he became close friends with a sharp, ambitious kid named Tony Spilatro. Years later, when Spilatro rose to become the Chicago outfit's man in Las Vegas, he brought his old friend out west to handle a special kind of work. Collada put together a burglary crew that became famous under a memorable name, the Hole in the Wall Gang. The name came from how they worked. Instead of going through doors and windows that were wired with alarms, they would simply cut straight through an outside wall or the roof and come in where no alarm was watching. The crew was good at it, pulling off somewhere between 250 and 300 break-ins around Las Vegas. But Collada was not just a thief. When Spilatro needed harder work done, Collada did it. He had a hand in at least 2 hits during his time in the desert. One of them, back in 1979, was a con man named Jerry Lisner, who was suspected of talking to a grand jury. On Spilatro's orders, Collada took care of the problem. Remember that detail, because it comes back later in one of the strangest ways imaginable. The whole operation came crashing down on the 4th of July in 1981.
The hole-in-the-wall gang set out to break into a high-end home furnishing store called Bertha's, not knowing that the police and the FBI were already waiting for them. The reason was almost too fitting.
Law enforcement had their own informant planted inside Culotta's crew, so they knew the job was coming before it happened. The gang was rounded up, and Culotta ended up behind bars. That is when his world flipped upside down. The friendship between Culotta and Spilatro had been falling apart, and while he was locked up, Culotta came to understand that a contract had been put out on his own life by the very people he had served. Facing that, he made his choice. In the early 1980s, he agreed to cooperate with the government. In exchange, he was given a deal and brought into witness protection, and he testified against Spilatro and a string of others across Las Vegas and Chicago. As for Spilatro, his time ran out a few years later. He and his brother were taken out by the outfit in 1986. Here is where Culotta starts to look a lot like Henry Hill from the very beginning of our story. He did not vanish into a quiet, hidden life. After a couple of years in the protection program, he left it and lived more or less in the open. He used to say he was not even afraid, because anyone who might have come after him was already locked away or already gone. The danger that was supposed to shadow the rest of his life had mostly aged out. Now comes the twist that ties this entire story into a knot. The book that the movie Goodfellas is based on was written by a journalist named Nicholas Pileggi. That same writer also wrote a book about the mob's grip on Las Vegas, and when he did, one of his most valuable sources was Frank Culotta. The book became a major film directed by Martin Scorsese, the very same director who made Goodfellas. And Scorsese did not just use Culotta's stories. He hired the former mobster as a consultant on the movie to make sure the world on screen felt real. Culotta even appeared in the film himself, playing an enforcer who handles the dirty work. Then came the moment that almost sounds made up. The film needed to show the scene where Jerry Lisner is taken out, the con man Culotta had done away with in real life back in 1979. Scorsese wanted it to feel authentic, so he turned to the one person who knew exactly how it had happened. He had Frank Culotta step in front of the camera and recreate the very thing he had done all those years before. A real informant reenacting his own real crime, directed by one of the greatest filmmakers alive. Think hard about what that actually means for our whole question. The reality of Mafia Informants was never some hidden secret to the people who made Goodfellas. The same author and the same director sat down with a genuine informant, learned the truth of this life in detail, and even put him on screen to act out his own past. The messy, complicated truth about men who flip was right there in their own work, just a few years apart from Goodfellas itself. So when Goodfellas chooses to leave all of that out, to wrap up Henry Hill with a tidy, lonely little ending, that is not a case of the filmmakers not knowing better. It is a choice. And Culotta proved, just like Hill, that flipping does not erase a man. He spent his later years as a public figure, giving guided tours of old mob sites, helping a museum, writing books about his life, and even running his own video channel where he told his stories straight to a camera. The quiet, faceless ending the movies promise informants was nowhere to be found. He passed away in 2020 at the age of 81, a well-known storyteller of the very world he had once helped tear down. There is one last man left to meet, and his story strips everything down to the rawest version of the choice. Most of the men we have seen flipped to dodge a sentence, or after learning a threat was on its way. This man flipped only after his own people actually tried to do away with him, up close, and by some impossible luck, he survived it. What he did next turned that survival into one of the heaviest blows the mob ever took.
Section 10. The Man Who Would Not Stay Down. Of all the men in this story, Ken Ito might be the most unlikely. He was Japanese-American, born in California, and he carried a street name that fit him, Tokyo Joe. His path to the underworld was unlike anyone else's here. During the Second World War, as a young man, he was forced into one of the camps the United States used to hold Japanese Americans, locked away simply for who he was. It was inside that camp that he learned to gamble, and gambling would shape the rest of his life. After the war, he made his way to Chicago, fell in with the Chicago outfit, and slowly built a name running their gambling operations. In time, he became the highest-ranking Asian American the outfit ever had. By the early 1980s, the law had caught up with him. The FBI uncovered his gambling business, and in early 1983, he was convicted, with his sentencing only weeks away. To the bosses above him, that timing was a danger. They worried that Ito, staring at prison, might decide to talk. And here is a detail that matters more than almost anything else in his story. He had already been asked to cooperate, and he had already said no. An agent had approached him earlier and tried to bring him over, and Ito turned her down flat, telling her plainly that becoming an informant was simply not who he was. He was not looking for a way out. He had made his peace with doing the time. The outfit did not trust him to keep quiet, so they decided to remove the risk entirely. On a February night in 1983, Ito was invited to a meeting and got into a car with two men he knew. As they sat parked, one of those men suddenly drew a weapon and fired at him 3 times from only inches away, aiming straight at his head. By any normal logic, that should have been the end of Ken Ito. It was not. Incredibly, not one of the 3 rounds got through. He was badly hurt, but he was alive, and he had the presence of mind to slump over and pretend he was finished. Once the men left, believing the job was done, Ito pulled himself out of the car, dragged himself to a nearby drugstore, and called for help. That failed attempt changed everything, and not in the way the outfit hoped. The man who had flatly refused to inform now had every reason in the world to do it. The people he had stayed loyal to had just tried to do away with him without a second thought, over nothing more than a suspicion of what he might one day say. Whatever loyalty had kept him silent was gone the instant that weapon went off. Ito agreed to cooperate, and he did not do it halfway. Over the next 17 years, the information he provided helped convict around 15 members and associates of the Chicago outfit, including police officers who had been working both sides. The man they had tried to erase became one of the most damaging witnesses the Chicago mob ever faced. There is a grim final piece to the attempt on his life. The 2 men who had failed to finish the job did not get a second chance, and they did not get forgiveness. In the outfit, falling short on something that important carried its own punishment. Not long after, both of them turned up in the trunk of a car. The same machine that had tried to remove Ito now removed the men who had let him live. Word of it spread through the underworld fast, and the lesson could not have been clearer. That, more than any single betrayal, is the thing that doomed the famous code from the inside. An organization that destroys its own people over mistakes and hunches hands every single member a powerful reason to run to the other side the moment a chance appears. Loyalty cannot survive in a place where staying loyal gets you nothing. What happened to Ito afterward is its own quiet lesson. Unlike Henry Hill, and unlike Frank Collada, he did not chase fame or tell his story to cameras. He slipped into witness protection and truly disappeared, living out his years under a name that was not his own. He passed away in 2004, an old man of 84, gone from natural causes far from Chicago, so far out of sight that the public did not even learn of it until 2 years later. In a strange way,
His ending is the closest any of these men came to the calm, faceless life Goodfellas promises at its close. But notice the price of that peace.
He only got it by vanishing completely, and even that quiet old age was something he had to crawl toward, after the people he trusted put 3 rounds in his head. Ito is the rawest answer to the question this whole video has been asking. Goodfellas shows the decision to flip as a tense but clean moment. A man weighing his options at a kitchen table and choosing the easy way out. For so many real informants, the choice did not look anything like that. It came only after the organization had already tried to end them, when there were no good options left and nothing pure left to protect. The film treats flipping as a fall from honor. The truth is that, for men like Ito, there was no honor left to fall from. It had already been spent the moment a friend turned around in a parked car and took aim. That is the version of this choice the movies almost never have the stomach to show you. 10 men.
10 different ranks. 10 different reasons. 10 very different endings. From a quiet old age under a false name, to 2 men left in a car trunk, to a chef in a small town waiting for a knock that never came. Lay them all side by side, and a single picture starts to form. One that explains not just what Goodfellas chose to leave out, but why it had to leave it out, and what that quiet little ending is really protecting you from. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.